On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a man named Delmar Kowalski stood at the edge of his equipment yard in Chickasaw County, Iowa, and watched his neighbor drive away without saying goodbye. The neighbor had come to drop something off. He'd backed his truck to the fence line, unhooked a chain, and let a broken moldboard plow section slide off the tailgate into the mud. Then he'd climbed back in the cab, rolled down the window just long enough to say, "I don't know what else to do with it," and driven away down the county road without looking back. The plow section was cracked along the shin, twisted at the land side, and worn to almost nothing at the share point. A commercial repair shop would have told him it wasn't worth fixing. A parts dealer would have told him the casting was too far gone to salvage. Most people would have told him to haul it to the scrap yard and order a new one. Delmar Kowalski looked at it for a long time, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, reading things other people couldn't see. Then he picked it up, carried it into his barn, and set it on the table next to his forge. That was the beginning. Or rather, that was the middle. The beginning had happened 40 years earlier, in a different barn with a different fire. Let me tell you about Delmar Kowalski because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built, and you need to understand what he built before you can understand what was lost when it was gone, and you need to understand what was lost before you can understand why. On a cold morning in November of 2012, 47 farmers drove from 5 different counties to stand in a field outside of Lawler, Iowa, and watch a man who hadn't spoken in 3 years try to say something worth hearing. Delmar was born in 1941 on a farm his grandfather had homesteaded in 1902. The land was 160 acres of rolling ground in the northeast corner of Chickasaw County. The kind of country that doesn't get talked about much in the farming magazines because it isn't flat enough to be spectacular and isn't hilly enough to be scenic. It's just ground. Good ground, but demanding ground, full of rocks that frost heaved up every spring like the earth was trying to return something it had borrowed. His grandfather had cleared it by hand. His father had farmed it with horses until 1953 when he finally bought a tractor, a used Oliver 88, that Delmar spent the next 3 years learning to take apart and put back together in the machine shed while his father watched from a stool and offered corrections that were usually right. That was how Delmar was educated. Not in a classroom, though he finished high school and thought briefly about the agricultural program at Iowa State before deciding his education was already underway and a college couldn't improve on it. His education happened in that machine shed, over a workbench his grandfather had built from white oak planks, under a single bulb that swung in the draft from the door. He learned to read metal the way some people learn to read faces, by spending time with it, by watching how it moved and where it failed and what it was trying to tell you before it broke. His father sent him to a blacksmith named August Tesdall when Delmar was 15. August was 67 years old and had been shoeing horses and repairing farm equipment in Chickasaw County since 1921. He had a forge shop behind his house on the edge of New Hampton that smelled of coal smoke and hot iron and the particular mineral sharpness of quenched steel. He charged $3 an hour, and he didn't take apprentices, but he made an exception for Delmar because Delmar's father asked and because, as August told it later, the boy already knew how to watch without fidgeting, which was rarer than it sounded. Delmar spent 2 summers with August Tesdall. He learned to build and tend a fire. He learned the colors of hot iron, the dull red that meant the metal was warm but not ready, the bright orange that meant it was moving, the yellow-white that meant you had about 30 seconds before you were doing more harm than good. He learned to read a piece of broken equipment, not as a problem to be discarded, but as a question to be answered. August had a saying he repeated so often that Delmar could recite it before he'd fully understood it. The metal will tell you what it needs if you stop trying to tell it what to do. August Tesdall died in 1961. His forge shop was sold, the equipment auctioned off, the building eventually torn down to make a parking lot for a new farm supply store. Delmar bought August's post vise at the auction for $11 and a set of handled hammers for $6. He carried them home and set them in the corner of his machine shed and started building his own forge from a truck wheel rim, a salvaged blower, and a length of pipe. It took him 3 months to get it right. He never stopped using it. Let me tell you about what Delmar built in that barn over the next 50 years, because it wasn't just a forge shop, and it wasn't just a repair service. It was something that doesn't have a good name in modern language, because the thing it was most like doesn't exist anymore. By 1970, word had gotten around Chickasaw County that if you had a piece of iron that was broken in a way that didn't fit the parts catalog, you could take it to Delmar Kowalski's barn and he would look at it. He didn't advertise. He didn't have a sign. He had a phone that he answered when he felt like it, and a reputation that spread the way reputations spread in farm country, which is slowly and then all at once. A man would break a cultivator shank in May, when the dealer's parts were back-ordered 3 weeks and the ground was ready now. And someone would say, quietly, the way people say things they aren't sure they should be saying, "Have you tried Delmar?" And the man would drive out to the farm on the county road and find Delmar in the barn and show him the broken piece, and Delmar would turn it over in his hands for a while and then tell him to come back Thursday. He didn't fix everything. He was clear about that. Some things were too far gone. Some alloys were too modern to work at the forge. Some repairs would fail faster than the original break. When he couldn't fix something, he said so, and he said why, and the explanation was usually more useful than the fix would have been. But when he could fix something, the repair was better than new. Not just functional, better, stronger at the point of failure than the original casting, because Delmar built repairs the way August had taught him. Not to restore the original shape, but to understand why the original shape had failed and to address that failure in the repair. By 1980, farmers were coming from outside Chickasaw County. By 1987, the year the neighbor dropped the broken moldboard section over the fence, Delmar had a waiting list that sometimes stretched to 6 weeks and a barn full of equipment in various stages of repair that represented collectively something like a museum of Midwestern farming across 4 decades. Plowshares and cultivator teeth and disc blades and drawbar hitches and PTO guards and sprocket carriers and things that had lost their names along with their function. He kept records in a composition notebook, a new one every year, each piece of equipment logged with the owner's name, the date received, the nature of the break, the repair method, and the date returned. By 2012, he had 31 composition notebooks on a shelf above the workbench. He charged less than anyone thought was reasonable. He charged what he thought the work was worth, which was usually less than what the work would have cost anywhere else, and occasionally nothing at all if the farmer was having a hard year, and the repair was something Delmar found interesting enough to justify doing for free. He never talked about money, and he never argued about it. You paid what he asked, or you didn't come back, and in 50 years, nobody had chosen not to come back. Now let me tell you about the thing that was coming, because it had been coming for a long time, and most people in Chickasaw County either didn't see it or didn't want to. Delmar had a stroke in September of 2009. He was 68 years old, and he was standing at the forge when it happened, which was where he was standing for most of his waking hours. His wife, Norma, found him on the floor of the barn with the hammer still in his hand and the iron cooling in the fire. He was in the hospital for 11 days. He came home in October and spent the winter in the house, which was the longest he'd gone without working in the barn since he was 12 years old and had broken his arm falling out of the haymow. He recovered most of what the stroke had taken, but not all of it. His right hand, his hammer hand, had lost some of its precision. He could still work, but he worked slower, and the work cost him more than it had. He was back at the forge by February of 2010, and most people who brought equipment to the barn didn't notice a difference in the quality of the repairs. But Delmar noticed. He noticed every day. He had a second stroke in March of 2012. This one was worse. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks and in a rehabilitation facility for 2 months after that. When he came home in June, he could walk, and he could think, and he could hold a conversation. But his right hand was unreliable in a way that made forge work impossible. He could not control the hammer. He could not read the iron through his grip the way he needed to. He sat in the barn for hours at a time and watched the forge and did not light it. His son, Gerald, who farmed the home place and had learned enough from his father to handle basic repairs, took over the waiting list. Gerald was a competent mechanic and a careful man, but he was not a blacksmith. He could weld. He could replace worn parts. He could do the kind of work that a good farm mechanic can do with modern equipment and modern materials. What he could not do was what his father had done, which was something different from welding and something different from mechanics, something that existed in the space between craft and intuition that takes decades to build and cannot be transferred in months. The waiting list shrank. Not because the need had gone away, but because the thing people had been coming for was no longer available. The farmers who had been bringing their broken equipment to Delmar's barn for 20 years understood the difference immediately. Some of them tried to explain it to their neighbors who hadn't been customers and found they couldn't quite put it into words. It was the difference between a doctor who treated your symptoms and a doctor who understood your body. It was the difference between a repair that held and a repair that healed. By October of 2012, Delmar had not worked at the forge in 7 months. The fire had not been lit. The barn was quiet in a way that felt wrong to everyone who had ever heard it, full of the sound of iron on iron, and the breath of the bellows and the particular focused silence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Let me tell you about the morning of November 14th, 2012, because it's the reason this story is still being told in Chickasaw County, and it's the reason Delmar Kowalski's name means something that a name like his doesn't usually get to mean. It started with a phone call. Gerald took it at 7 in the morning. It was a farmer named Cletus Drummond from over in Floyd County, a man who had been bringing equipment to Delmar's barn since 1994, and who had heard about the second stroke but hadn't fully accepted what it meant. Cletus had a situation. He had a set of subsoiler shanks that had been repaired by Delmar in 2007 and had held perfectly for 5 years, and now one of them had cracked again. Not at the repair, but adjacent to it, in the way that sometimes happens when one part of a piece of metal is made stronger than the surrounding material. He needed it fixed before the ground froze. He'd tried 2 welding shops and a farm equipment dealer in 3 counties, and none of them had been able to give him a repair he trusted. He wasn't asking for a miracle. He was asking if there was any chance. Gerald told him there wasn't. He told him his father wasn't working and didn't expect to work again, and he was sorry, and he gave him the name of a shop in Waterloo that did good work. Cletus thanked him and hung up. Gerald went to the barn to start his own morning and found his father already there, sitting on the stool next to the forge with the composition notebook from 2007 open on his knee. Delmar had found the entry for Cletus Drummond's subsoiler shanks. He was reading it with the careful attention of a man reviewing evidence. He didn't look up when Gerald came in. "Cletus called," Gerald said. "I know," Delmar said. His speech had slowed since the second stroke, each word placed deliberately, like a man carrying something fragile. "I heard. I told him you weren't working." Delmar turned a page in the notebook. He read for a while. Then he said, "Call him back." Gerald looked at his father for a long moment. He looked at the right hand resting on the open notebook, the hand that could no longer hold a hammer with any precision. He thought about saying something practical. He thought about the liability of a repair done badly by a man who could no longer do it well. He thought about his father sitting in this barn for 7 months, watching a cold forge. "All right," Gerald said. "Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about something larger, and you need to understand the sequence of it to understand what it meant." Gerald called Cletus Drummond back and told him to come. Then, because he wasn't sure what was going to happen, and because he thought witnesses might matter, he called 2 other farmers who had been longtime customers and told them the same thing. Word moved the way it always moves in farm country, which is faster than anyone expects, and with more detail than anyone intended. By the time Cletus Drummond arrived at 11 that morning with his cracked subsoiler shank in the bed of his truck, there were 9 trucks parked along the county road in front of Delmar's farm. Delmar was in the barn. He had lit the forge. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a person do something they've done for 50 years? Something that lives so deep in their muscle and memory that it operates below the level of conscious thought? Have you ever watched a carpenter who's been swinging a hammer since he was 10 years old? Or a surgeon who's been making incisions since before you were born? Or a musician who learned their instrument before they learned to read? There's a quality to that kind of work that's different from skill. Skill is what you can teach. What Delmar had was something that had been deposited in him over decades, layer by layer, the way sediment builds up in a river bend until it had become structural. It was part of the load-bearing architecture of who he was. The stroke had damaged the mechanism, but not the architecture. Cletus brought the shank into the barn and set it on the table. Delmar looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up with both hands and turned it slowly, the way he'd always done, reading the metal, reading the crack, reading the history of stress and impact and use that had led to this particular failure in this particular place. His right hand was unsteady. Anyone watching could see that. But the reading didn't require the hammer. The reading was something else. He set the shank down and looked at the forge. He looked at his right hand. He looked at Gerald, who was standing near the door with the expression of a man watching something he doesn't know how to stop and isn't sure he should. "I'm going to need you to hold the hammer," Delmar said. Gerald had never done forge work. He could weld, he could wrench, but he had never stood at the forge with his father and done the work his father did. Delmar had never asked him to. There had always been the implicit understanding that the forge was Delmar's territory, that the skill was Delmar's alone, that Gerald's role on the farm was different and equally necessary but separate. This was the first time in Gerald's 41 years that his father had asked him to stand at the forge. "Tell me what to do," Gerald said. "I'll tell you," Delmar said. "Just do what I say when I say it. Don't do anything I don't tell you to do." What followed over the next 4 hours was something that the 9 farmers standing in and around that barn would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. It was not a normal repair. It was not one man working. It was something more like a translation. Delmar's knowledge moving through words and gestures into Gerald's hands. Delmar reading the metal and reading the fire and directing every movement of the hammer with a precision that his own hands could no longer achieve, but his mind could still specify exactly. Gerald struck when Delmar said strike, stopped when Delmar said stop, moved the shank in the fire when Delmar said move it, and pulled it when Delmar said now. He quenched when Delmar said quench, and dressed the surface when Delmar said dress it, and did not once act on his own judgment, because his own judgment was not the point. Delmar's judgment was the point, and Delmar's judgment was intact. The shank came out of that barn repaired in the way Delmar's repairs had always come out. Not just functional, but considered. The crack addressed at its cause rather than its symptom. The repair built to redirect stress rather than simply fill the gap. Cletus Drummond picked it up and turned it over in his hands with the expression of a man who has just been given back something he'd thought was lost. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "That's a Delmar repair." "Yes, it is," Delmar said. The 9 farmers in the barn were quiet for a moment. Then one of them, a man named Virgil Hassel, who had been bringing equipment to Delmar's barn since 1989, said, "Can you do mine next?" Let me tell you about what happened over the following 3 weeks, because it matters, and because it changed the shape of the story in ways nobody had anticipated. Word spread through 5 counties in 48 hours. Farmers who had been sitting on broken equipment they hadn't been able to get repaired properly since Delmar's second stroke started calling Gerald's phone. The waiting list, which had been empty for 7 months, filled up in 3 days. Farmers drove in from Floyd County and Mitchell County and Howard County and Winneshiek County with equipment in their truck beds and trailers, things they'd been nursing through the season with temporary fixes and workarounds, waiting without quite admitting they were waiting for Delmar's barn to be open again. Delmar worked every day. He worked with Gerald at the hammer, and, as the weeks went on, with 2 other men who came and offered their hands and their strength and their willingness to do exactly what they were told. One of them was a younger farmer named Aaron Borgman, who'd grown up on the road and had been watching Delmar work since he was a child. The other was a retired machinist named Elmer Peterson, who had never done forge work but understood metal in the way that machinists do. From the other direction, from precision rather than fire, and who turned out to be a natural at reading Delmar's directions and translating them into hammer work. The arrangement was unusual. It was not apprenticeship in the traditional sense, because there wasn't time for the slow accumulation that apprenticeship requires. It was something more immediate, more urgent, more like a man dictating a letter he knows he may not have time to finish. Delmar talked more in those 3 weeks than he had in the previous 3 years combined. He explained things he had never explained before because he had never needed to. Things he had always simply done. The reasoning behind decisions that had become automatic. The principles behind techniques that had become instinctive. He talked about the colors of the fire and what they meant. He talked about the difference between a crack that had happened suddenly and a crack that had been building for years, and how you could read the difference in the metal's grain. He talked about why he built repairs the way he did, why he addressed the cause rather than the symptom. Why a repair that was stronger than the surrounding material was sometimes worse than a repair that matched it. Aaron Borgman listened to all of it and wrote some of it down. Elmer Peterson listened to all of it and filed it away in the organized way that machinists file information, in categories and sequences and relationships. Gerald listened to all of it and felt something shifting in his understanding of his father that he couldn't quite name. Something like discovering that the house you grew up in had rooms you'd never been shown. Let me tell you about the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, because it's the afternoon the story turned into something it hadn't been before. A man named Mitch Crowley drove out to Delmar's farm in a truck that had the logo of a regional farm equipment dealership on the door. Mitch was the service manager for the dealership, a man who had been in the farm equipment business for 22 years and who had a professional opinion about most things related to farm machinery repair. He had heard about what was happening at Delmar's barn from a customer who had brought in a piece of equipment and mentioned in passing that he'd had it repaired at Kowalski's place over in Chickasaw County, the old blacksmith. Mitch had driven out partly out of professional curiosity and partly out of the kind of territorial instinct that service managers develop after 2 decades in a business where every repair done by someone else is a repair not done by you. He came into the barn while Delmar and Gerald and Aaron were working on a set of chisel plow points that a farmer from Mitchell County had brought in the day before. He watched for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You know they make those in hardened steel now. You can order a whole set for about $200. Delmar didn't look up. "I know," he said. "Faster than doing it this way," Mitch said. "For some people," Delmar said. Mitch watched the work for another few minutes. He had the expression of a man who is trying to find the flaw in an argument he doesn't want to agree with. "The thing I don't understand," he said, "is why anyone drives out here when they could just order parts." Delmar set down the tongs and looked at Mitch Crowley with the patient attention of a man who has been asked a question he has answered many times in his own mind and is deciding whether it's worth answering out loud. "Because the part they need isn't in the catalog," he said. "Because the equipment they're running is 30 years old, and the manufacturer stopped making parts for it in 1995. Because the piece that's broken isn't a standard piece. It's been modified 3 times by 3 different owners, and there's no catalog number for what it's become. Because sometimes the repair teaches you something about why it broke that helps you not break it again. Because some people would rather fix a thing than throw it away." He picked up the tongs again. "Any of those answers work for you?" Mitch Crowley stood in the barn for another 10 minutes without saying much. When he left, he sat in his truck in the driveway for a while before he drove away. Gerald watched him from the barn door and couldn't tell what the man was thinking. He found out 6 days later when Mitch called and asked if Delmar would be willing to talk to the service technicians at the dealership. Not to work for them, just to talk. To explain some of what he knew about older equipment and forge repair and the kind of diagnostic thinking that the dealership's technicians, who were trained on modern computerized systems, didn't have much exposure to. Mitch said he'd pay for Delmar's time. He said he thought it would be useful. Gerald brought the request to his father. Delmar thought about it for 2 days. Then he said yes. Let me tell you about what happened at that dealership in January of 2013, because it surprised everyone, including Delmar, and because it set in motion something that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted. There were 11 service technicians in the room, ranging in age from 23 to 51. Most of them had been trained on modern equipment with electronic diagnostic systems and hydraulic controls and computer-managed engine management. They were good at what they did. They could diagnose a fault code in minutes and replace a module in an hour and get a machine back in the field the same day. What they struggled with, and what their customers increasingly struggled with was the older equipment that still represented a significant portion of what was being farmed in northeastern Iowa. Equipment from the 1970s and 1980s that had no diagnostic ports and no fault codes and no modules to replace. Equipment that communicated its problems the old way, through sound and heat and wear patterns and the particular way metal fails when it's been asked to do something it wasn't designed for. Delmar talked for 2 hours. He talked about how to read a brake. He talked about the difference between a fatigue failure and an impact failure and a stress concentration failure, and why the difference mattered for how you repaired it. He talked about the metallurgy of old farm equipment castings, the way iron and steel behaved differently under heat, the way a repair done with the wrong filler material could create a new failure point adjacent to the original. He talked about the diagnostic value of dirt and rust and wear patterns, the way a machine that's been running wrong for years leaves evidence of it in places that aren't the place where it finally broke. The technicians asked questions. Good questions. The kind that told Delmar they were paying attention and thinking about what he was saying in relation to things they'd seen in their own work. The youngest one, a 23-year-old named Isaac, who had grown up on a farm in Winneshiek County and still helped his father on weekends, asked about a specific failure mode he'd been seeing in a particular brand of older cultivator frame and couldn't diagnose. Delmar asked him 3 questions about the machine, thought for a moment, and told him exactly what was wrong and why and how to fix it. Isaac stared at him for a second and then wrote it all down very fast. Mitch Crowley sat in the back of the room and didn't say much. At the end, he shook Delmar's hand and said, "I should have come out to your barn 20 years ago." Delmar said, "Yes, you should have." And there was no meanness in it, just the flat accuracy of a man stating a fact. The dealership invited Delmar back 3 more times over the following year. The sessions grew. Other dealerships heard about them and sent technicians. The Agricultural Extension Service at Iowa State heard about them and sent a representative who asked if Delmar would be willing to contribute to a documentation project they were developing on traditional metalworking techniques in agricultural contexts. Delmar said he'd think about it. He thought about it for a week and then said yes, on the condition that Aaron Borgman and Elmer Peterson were included, because they had learned things in those 3 weeks at the forge that deserved to be in the record alongside what he knew. Let me tell you about the composition notebooks because they matter more than almost anything else in this story. In the spring of 2013, Gerald brought the 31 composition notebooks down from the shelf above the workbench and spread them out on the kitchen table. Each one represented a year of work, a year of farmers and broken equipment and repairs and the particular knowledge that each repair had required. Together, they represented something like a technical history of farming in northeastern Iowa across 5 decades, told through the specific language of what broke and how it was fixed and what the fixing revealed about the breaking. The Iowa State Extension representative, a woman named Dr. Rachel Lindgren, who had grown up in farm country and understood what she was looking at, spent 3 days at the kitchen table reading the notebooks. She said afterward that they were the most detailed primary source documentation of traditional agricultural blacksmithing practice she had ever encountered. Not because Delmar had written them for posterity. He had written them purely as work records, but because the precision of his observations had accidentally produced exactly the kind of technical detail that historians and material scientists and agricultural engineers needed and almost never had access to. The notebooks were eventually digitized and archived at Iowa State. Copies went to the Smithsonian's agricultural collections. A paper was published in an agricultural history journal that cited them extensively. Delmar read the paper once and said it was accurate, which was the highest praise he was known to give. He kept working through 2013 and into 2014, with Gerald and Aaron and Elmer at the hammer. The four of them developing a rhythm that had become something like a genuine craft practice in its own right, different from what Delmar had done alone, but carrying the same knowledge through a different mechanism. The waiting list stayed full. The farmers kept coming. Delmar had a third stroke in August of 2014. He was 73 years old. He did not recover from this one in the way he had recovered from the others. He came home from the hospital in September and spent the fall in the house, and in December he told Gerald that he didn't think he was going to be back in the barn. Gerald didn't argue. He sat with his father for a while in the kitchen and then went to the barn and stood at the forge for a long time without lighting it. He thought about the 4 years since the second stroke and what had happened in them. The work and the talking and the notebooks and the sessions at the dealership and the extension project and the paper in the journal and the farmers from 5 counties who had been coming to this barn for 25 years with their broken equipment and their trust. He thought about what his father had built, not just the skill, but the institution of it, the way a community had organized itself around one man's knowledge over half a century. He lit the forge. Aaron Borgman was there the next morning. Elmer Peterson came in the afternoon. They worked on a broken disc blade carrier that a farmer from Howard County had dropped off the week before. They worked carefully, and they worked slowly, and they talked through every decision the way Delmar had taught them to talk through decisions. Not just doing, but explaining. Not just fixing, but understanding. The repair took longer than it would have taken Delmar. It was good work. Let me tell you about the visit that happened in February of 2015, because it's the visit that closed the circle on something that had been open for a long time. Mitch Crowley came back to the farm. He didn't call ahead. He drove out on a Wednesday afternoon and knocked on the farmhouse door, and Norma let him in, and he sat at the kitchen table across from Delmar, who was thinner than he'd been and moved more carefully, but whose eyes were the same as they'd always been. The eyes of a man who was paying attention to things other people weren't paying attention to. Mitch had something he wanted to say. He'd been working up to it for a while, Gerald suspected, possibly since the afternoon in December of 2012, when he'd sat in his truck in the driveway trying to figure out what he was thinking. He said that his dealership had started carrying a line of older equipment parts that they hadn't carried before, cast iron and forged steel components for machines from the 1970s and 1980s, because enough of their customers were running that equipment and needed those parts, and he'd realized that there was a market he'd been ignoring. He said that 2 of his technicians, including Isaac, had started doing forge work on the side after taking a class that Aaron Borgman had started teaching at the county extension office. He said that the class had a waiting list. He said that he'd been thinking about something Delmar had said in that first session at the dealership. Something about how a repair that was stronger than the surrounding material was sometimes worse than a repair that matched it, and how he'd started applying that principle to the way his shop approached modifications and upgrades on older equipment, and how it had changed the way they thought about the work. He said he wasn't sure he could explain exactly what had changed, but that something had. Delmar listened to all of this without interrupting. When Mitch finished, Delmar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "August, Tesdall told me something when I was 15 years old. He said the metal will tell you what it needs if you stop trying to tell it what to do." He looked at Mitch. "That's not just about metal." Mitch Crowley nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had driven a long way to hear something and had heard it. He came back 3 more times before Delmar died in October of 2016. They didn't always talk about Meadow. Sometimes they talked about the county, about farming, about the way things were changing and the things that didn't change. Mitch brought his youngest son once, a boy of about 12 who sat in the corner of the kitchen and listened with the focused attention of a child who knows he's in the presence of something important without being able to say what it is. Delmar Kowalski was buried in the cemetery outside of Lawler on a Thursday in October, and the attendance at the funeral was the kind of attendance that happens when a community loses something it didn't fully know it had until it was gone. There were farmers from 5 counties. There were technicians from 3 dealerships. There was a representative from Iowa State. There was a man from the Smithsonian who had driven from Washington and stood in the back and didn't introduce himself to anyone. There was August Tesdall's granddaughter, who had found out about Delmar through the journal paper and had driven from Des Moines to be there because she thought her grandfather would have wanted someone from his family to represent him. Gerald spoke at the service. He talked about the forge and the notebooks and the farmers and the repairs. He talked about the morning of November 14th, 2012, when his father had asked him to hold the hammer, and what it had felt like to stand at the forge for the first time and do what his father told him to do. He said that the most important thing his father had ever taught him was that knowledge doesn't live in a person. It lives in the relationship between a person and the people they're willing to teach, and that the only way to lose it is to stop passing it on. Let me tell you about the barn now, because it's still there and the forge is still lit. Aaron Borgman teaches the forge class at the county extension office twice a year. He has a waiting list that runs to 18 months. He uses Delmar's methods and Delmar's principles, and when he teaches the diagnostic work, he reads from Delmar's composition notebooks the way a teacher reads from a primary source, not as instruction but as evidence of what careful observation looks like when it's been practiced for 50 years. His students include farmers and mechanics and one retired engineer from Cedar Rapids who drives 2 hours each way because, as he told Aaron once, he'd spent 40 years working with metal and had never understood it the way he understood it after 3 sessions in Aaron's class. Elmer Peterson, who is 74 years old and has no intention of retiring, works at the forge 3 days a week. He has developed a specialty in older cast iron repairs that few shops anywhere in the region can match. Farmers still drive from Floyd County and Mitchell County and Howard County and Winneshiek County to bring him broken equipment. He charges what he thinks the work is worth and occasionally nothing at all, if the farmer's having a hard year and the repair is something he finds interesting enough to justify doing for free. Gerald Kowalski farms the home place, the same 160 acres his great-grandfather homesteaded in 1902. He doesn't do forge work himself, but he manages the barn and the waiting list and the relationship with the extension program and the archive at Iowa State. He has his father's 31 composition notebooks on a shelf in the farmhouse, and he has started a 32nd one in his own handwriting, logging the work that comes through the barn now, the owners and the dates, and the nature of the breaks and the repair methods and the dates returned. He is not sure who will read it someday. He thinks someone will. Isaac, the 23-year-old technician who asked about the cultivator frame failure in January of 2013, is now 34 and runs his own repair shop in New Hampton, in a building 3 blocks from where August Tesdall's forge shop used to stand before it was torn down to make a parking lot. He doesn't know that history, but Gerald knows it, and Gerald has been meaning to tell him for a while. Mitch Crowley's son, the 12-year-old who sat in the corner of the kitchen and listened, is 22 now and is in his 2nd year of the agricultural mechanics program at Iowa State. His father told him about Delmar when he was old enough to understand what he'd been sitting in the presence of, and the son has been trying to understand it more completely ever since. He called Gerald last spring and asked if he could come out to the barn. Gerald said yes. The boy spent a Saturday watching Aaron and Elmer work and asking questions that were better than most questions Gerald had heard from people twice his age. He came back the following Saturday. He has been back 6 times since. Let me tell you one last thing, because it's the thing that matters most, and it's the thing that's hardest to say directly. What Delmar Kowalski built in that barn over 50 years was not a business. It was not a service. It was not even exactly a craft, though it was all of those things. What he built was a way of paying attention to the world that was specific enough to be useful and broad enough to be true. He paid attention to metal, but the principles he developed paying attention to metal turned out to apply to other things, to organizations and communities, and the way knowledge moves between people and the way institutions fail when they stop listening to what they're being told. The metal will tell you what it needs if you stop trying to tell it what to do. August Tesdall said that in 1956, and Delmar carried it for 60 years, and passed it to Gerald and Aaron and Elmer and Isaac, and a 22-year-old at Iowa State who doesn't yet know the full weight of what he's been handed. The forge in Delmar's barn is lit 3 days a week. The waiting list runs to 4 months. The 30-second composition notebook is about half full. Experts will tell you that traditional blacksmithing is a dying trade, that forge repair has been replaced by parts replacement, that the economics of skilled handwork can't compete with the economics of standardized manufacturing. They're not wrong about the economics. They're not entirely right about everything else. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. That's what happens when a man spends 50 years paying attention to what things need instead of what he wants them to be. That's what happens when a community shows up, one broken piece at a time, and a man answers the door every time. That's what happens when the knowledge in one man's hands finds its way into other hands before those hands go still. That's what happens when you stop trying to tell the metal what to do and start listening to what it's trying to.